Hello again, everybody. This is Rusty, aka William Robinson, aka Dr. Robinson, and I am the Blues Doctor. This is our podcast, The Blues Doctor Recommends, and we're glad you're here. This week is going to be a short week for us. We filmed late last week and early this week, so this week's program is going to be concise. That's a good word, right? Concise. That'll be our word of the day is concise. Any rate, hit thumbs up, sit back in your chair, share, make comments, suggestions, all of those things, and we'll get going. So let's go on to the calendar. On July 14th, 1982, Willie Nelson went to #1 on the country chart and then later on the overall Billboard chart with his album Always on My Mind. This album spent a total of 22 weeks at the top of the charts and stayed for 253 weeks on the Billboard country chart altogether. You know, who doesn't love Willie? He turned 92 years old in April of this year, and he's still performing. You know, I wanted to mention this because I saw Willie perform live in Memphis, Tennessee on August 16th, 1977, which was the day that Elvis died in Memphis. Willie, to start the show, actually had a moment of silence for Elvis. And then later in the show, he did the song Funny How Time Slips Away. And he mentioned that Elvis had recorded a version of that song, which Willie wrote. And Elvis' version had gone to #1 in 1972, and it made Willie a lot of money at the time when he was not particularly popular, and he really needed it at that point. So he was forever grateful to Elvis for that. In fact, during the song, Willie broke down and actually had to step away from the stage for a minute while the band kept playing. He composed himself, came back on, and finished the song, and looked up to the sky and said, "Thanks, Elvis." Anyway, that's my Willie Nelson story. And for the next item on the calendar, some people might say we're going from the sublime to the ridiculous, but I don't necessarily agree. On July 18th, 1929, that was the birthday of Screamin' Jay Hawkins. Screamin' Jay was a singer, musician, actor born in Cleveland, Ohio. He went into the Army in World War II. Afterward, he studied opera for a while, but dropped out to become a straight blues and R&B singer. He later became a solo performer, often performing in a very stylish wardrobe of leopard skins and red leather and wild hats and so forth. And then in 1956, he recorded what is probably the magnum opus of his career with the song I Put a Spell on You. Hawkins was said to have originally envisioned that tune as sort of a tender or refined ballad. However, the day they showed up to record it, one of the musicians actually brought in several cases of wine to the studio, and they all got ridiculously drunk before they started. So it turned out the resulting performance was not a ballad, but instead a kind of, they were described as a raw, guttural track that actually became his greatest commercial success and reportedly surpassed 1 million copies in the first year. In fact, Jay passed out after the recording, and when he woke up, he had no memory of either the session or the lyrics to the song, so he had to relearn them before he could start performing it again. In fact, he was in great demand for performances. He did several TV performances at the time and toured all over the world. His stage persona even became more outlandish at that point. He would come out in a coffin. The coffin would be rolled out on stage, and as the music started, Jay would slowly sit up out of it, look at the crowd, and he would have on a deep black cape and some red and gold suit like thing and a bone through his nose. He slowly got out of the coffin to rise. He went over to pick up a stick, like a broomstick, that had a skull on the end of it that was smoking a cigarette, which he called Henry. And he had all kinds of other things on the set, like snakes and various plants and stuff. And it all kind of vaguely suggested like a voodoo setting, but really with more of a comic relief to it. Screamin' Jay never rediscovered the success that he had with I Put a Spell on You. And he was never really as successful in the US as he was in Europe. And in his last years, he mostly toured and performed in Europe. In fact, Screamin' Jay died in 2000 in Paris of a ruptured aneurysm. And his performances, you have to say, were nothing if not memorable. Jay's life and career seemed to get crazier and crazier as time went on. One of his later songs was called Constipation Blues, for example, and included sounds like you might associate with constipation. And that was one of his better ones at the time. Jay was also said to have fathered somewhere between 50 and 75 children with over 30 different women. And he had a reunion, apparently, in the 1990s where about 15 or so of the kids showed up. And it was confirmed that he was their father, for better or worse. Looking back, it's hard to categorize Jay, as to what group or what genre to put him in. He was certainly influential in a sense. You could say he inspired the later shock rock artists like Alice Cooper or the early David Bowie or some others. I guess you could say, true, he was the first goth rock performer. I thought he was brilliant in his own way. So, R.I.P. Screaming Jay Hawkins. Let's move on to the medicine section now. I had an interesting report that I saw. The anti obesity drug Zepbound, which is also known as tirzepatide, which is commercially available for weight loss and for diabetes, and I think some other things. At any rate, a group of investigators presented a study at the Endocrine Society conference in Europe recently, in which they showed that tirzepatide could shrink breast cancer cell growth in mice. Basically, the study was that they took a group of laboratory mice, they fed them in a high calorie environment so that they gained weight, and they injected breast cancer cells into the mice so that they would have tumors also. And then they gave them the study drug, tirzepatide. It turned out that not only did the mice lose weight, they also survived longer from the breast cancer. In other words, the tumors shrank, the mice lived longer than the control group, which had gotten just a placebo, suggesting that there's some effect of the tirzepatide on the cancer itself. And that was reported, like I said, in Europe last week, and I'll put the link to that down below. Just to back up a little bit, tirzepatide is one of a new category of medicines that's being used to treat chronic obesity and insulin dependent diabetes and obstructive sleep apnea in the United States. There are drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy and a few others, I think, too. That drug, tirzepatide, and all the drugs in that category are fascinating because they attack a single marker or a single molecular target in the body. You might have heard of it called being called GLP-1 or something like that. Actually, there's a second target called GIP that tirzepatide also targets, but the other drugs don't. This dual action, targeting those two molecular things, it contributes to its effectiveness in managing weight and blood sugar and sleep apnea. We know that some of the mechanisms it has include things like increasing insulin release, slows gastric emptying so that you feel full longer, so you don't feel like you have to eat. Like I said, it's approved for type 2 diabetes, it's approved for chronic weight management and for obstructive sleep apnea. It does have some side effects that can be potentially serious, at least. The most common are gastrointestinal, including nausea, diarrhea, decreased appetite, vomiting, and so forth. And potentially, as according to this report, it may have some anti cancer effect. Seeing this report on tirzepatide recently reminded me that I had kind of planned on doing a talk on obesity related cancers at some point, and it seems like no time better than the present. There are several obesity related cancers, and I'm just going to name a few of them: endometrial or uterine cancer for one, breast cancer for another, colon rectum cancers. There are many more less common. Those are kind of the big three. Of those, I'm just going to talk a little bit about endometrial cancer because that's part of what I treated for many years when I was in practice. Endometrial cancer is related to obesity. It's also related to sex hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone. Sex hormones in humans are secreted on a very precise schedule. Basically, pre ovulatory, in other words, in that part of the woman's cycle before she ovulates or produces an egg, estrogen dominates. In other words, the ovaries secrete estrogen, and what that does is prepare the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus as it's otherwise known, to accept a fertilization. Okay. Then after ovulation, then progesterone dominates. In other words, the ovary produces relatively more progesterone. And what that does is it allows the potential embryo to implant and attach and dig into basically the endometrium so that the pregnancy can progress. If that ratio, however, is altered, in other words, one predominates over the other, particularly if you have relatively more estrogen than progesterone, things start to go wrong. In particular, the endometrium, or lining of the uterus, will start to grow uncontrollably. It'll start to get thicker and become more erratic in its physiology. It may start to shed and cause irregular bleeding in women. And eventually, it can even become neoplastic. In other words, it can turn to cancer. The risks for endometrial cancer include, as I mentioned, obesity, but perhaps even more important is age. In other words, endometrial cancer is generally a disease of postmenopausal women. The mean age of endometrial cancer in the United States is 65 years old. Typically, the symptoms associated with endometrial cancer, therefore, are postmenopausal bleeding. In other words, after a woman stops having periods, typically in their 50s, then they later on start bleeding again. That is a potential symptom of endometrial cancer and needs to be investigated. There are occasional other symptoms like pain or distant disease, but they're pretty unusual. Most of the time, endometrial cancer will suggest itself based on irregular bleeding. The way we diagnose endometrial cancer is essentially by just taking a piece of the tissue. You can do what's called an endometrial biopsy. That can be done in the doctor's office, and it's very easy. We do them all the time. You can potentially have a traditional D&C, or dilatation and curettage, in the hospital where you undergo anesthesia and remove some portion of the lining of the endometrium. In either case, you send that specimen to the pathologist who looks at it under the microscope and makes the diagnosis of endometrial cancer or not. The treatment for endometrial cancer most of the time revolves around surgery. And the surgery that we do for endometrial cancer almost always includes hysterectomy, or removal of the uterus. We typically will include removal of the ovaries and fallopian tubes at the same time. We might sometimes call that a bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy. And most of the time, too, we will probably suggest doing a lymph node sampling, in other words, removal of the lymph nodes in the pelvis and along the aorta to which endometrial cancer can potentially spread. Now, that surgery has changed significantly over the years in that we used to do it almost always open, or in other words, through an open incision in the abdomen. Most of the time now, we do it via minimally invasive techniques, either just laparoscopically or with the robot. And that actually works very well. Most women tolerate that surgery very well. They are in and out of the hospital in a day or so with relatively little morbidity. For more advanced disease, in other words, disease where the tumor has spread beyond the uterus, then you have to individualize. The treatment may include not only removal of the uterus and tubes and ovaries, but maybe removal of metastatic disease from other surfaces inside the abdomen. Or it may include other treatments like chemotherapy or occasionally even radiation therapy. One interesting group of women with endometrial cancer that has increased over the years in numbers is in younger women, particularly in younger women who are significantly obese. Just obesity by itself alters the ratio of estrogen to progesterone, and therefore throws the physiology of the uterus out of whack and encourages the development of endometrial cancer. That's particularly difficult because the treatment, as I mentioned before, for endometrial cancer usually is hysterectomy, but many of these young women may want to have children at some point. So you have to, again, individualize treatment for them. We have at times done treatment with hormonal type therapies first for women, young women with endometrial cancer. We have obviously encouraged them to lose weight, and sometimes that has worked. In other words, there are successful pregnancies that have resulted in women with endometrial cancer who have been treated with hormonal therapies. Perhaps the most interesting part of treatment for endometrial cancer for me, and the part of the treatment that has changed dramatically in the last 10 years or so, is in the molecularly targeted therapies. We know much more about the molecular structure of endometrial cancer than we did 10, 20 years ago. And we now have a number of additional therapies, targeted therapies, as a result. So, most patients now will undergo comprehensive molecular testing of the sample. In other words, they'll have surgery. The tumor will be removed, obviously, from the uterus. The uterus will be removed as well, obviously. But then some of that tissue will be sent to a specialized lab for comprehensive molecular testing. And from that, your doctor will develop a personalized regimen of drugs just for that particular cancer and for that particular patient. Some of these drugs can include things like the new PD-L1 inhibitors. You may have heard of the drug pembrolizumab. There are others like Opdivo and dostarlimab. Another group are the VEGF inhibitors, and those drugs include things like Avastin, which I've talked about here before, and lenvatinib. And there are several others that are just coming to the front, and I suspect there'll be many others behind that. So this is an important and fascinating component of treatment for endometrial cancer that we're just beginning to understand. Finally, the survival for endometrial cancer is entirely dependent, at least at this point, entirely dependent on stage. In other words, what stage the cancer is found in when it is diagnosed. When the cancers are confined to the uterus, and that would be either stage 1 or 2, the survival is very good. It's probably between 80 and 90% at 5 years, which is the major way we determine or measure survival in cancer patients. On the other hand, stage 3 and 4 cancers, which means they have spread to other areas in the body, have a much worse survival, somewhere between 10 and maybe 40%. Now, as I said, that may change with the development of new targeted agents. So, this is a particularly exciting field, I think, in oncology right now. And then moving on, in this segment, we typically talk about some of my other interests like professional wrestling or Bigfoot or other sort of strange events, quirky, unique things. I love talking about New Orleans and Memphis and some other places that I've called home. This week, my producer and I are planning on taking a trip later this summer, which will be something of a high strangeness tour of the United States. We're going to visit several places that are reported to be haunted, including the Villisca X murder house in Iowa. We'll go to some sites of reported UFO sightings, some ancient petroglyphs. I always like looking at petroglyphs, and even a Bigfoot museum that I haven't been to before. So we'll update you as that gets closer and give you some more details. For our music segment this week, how about another tune from the New Orleans club scene? I always like that. So we'll find another one here for you. And that's about all I had for this week. If you are interested in using drugs like tirzepatide or Ozempic or the other ones, make sure to discuss it thoroughly with your doctor. I did not go into much detail here about the side effects, some of which are potentially serious. So you really want to think carefully before starting one of those drugs. They have become available online now from overseas without a prescription, and I would not encourage anybody approaching it that way. Also, if you have a chance, I would strongly encourage you to look up I Put a Spell on You in its entirety by Screamin' Jay Hawkins. If you haven't seen that yet, you will be in for a surprise, and I just love it. Anyway, finally, as I say each week, please watch next week's podcast. Okay? See you later.